Good evening and welcome to the first live session of Duke Reads for this academic year. I'm Frank Stasio, host of The State of Things on North Carolina Public Radio, WUNC, and I am very happy to be taking part in Duke Reads. Our first book this year is the children's book by A.S. Byatt. Chosen. I hired an athlete here at Duke to actually carry the book for me. It was chosen by Kimerly Rorschach, the Mary D.B.T. and James H. Semans director of the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke, celebrating its 5th year. Happy birthday, 5 years this past Saturday.
Yes, indeed. Thank you, Frank. It's gone very quickly.
That's wonderful. Well, let's talk a little bit more about you before we get into the book. Kim Rorschach has been director of the Duke since 2005. She opened the museum and has quickly built a robust program focusing on modern and contemporary art, with an emphasis on service to the university and the broader community. Many of the museum's programs have won national acclaim. The current exhibitions include The Record, Contemporary Art and Vinyl, and The Vorticists, Rebel Arts in London and New York from 1914 to 1918, both organized by Nasher and traveling to other venues as well. She's also adjunct professor in Duke's Department of Art, Art History, and Visual Studies, and chairs Duke's Council for the Arts. Kim is a former director of the University of Chicago's David and Alfred Smart Museum of Art, held curatorial positions at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and the Rosenbach Museum and Library in Philadelphia. She is a member and former trustee of the Association of Art Museum Directors, chaired its Government Affairs Committee from 2002 to 2004, a Fulbright scholar, and Kim Rorschach holds a Ph.D. in art history from Yale University. She said she chose the children's book by A.S. Byatt because the opening scenes take place in a great museum, and that immediately pulled me in. She indicates that she is also interested in the history of our great museums. The history of the Victoria and Albert Museum is a fascinating one that is important to understanding the modern conception and evolution of museums in Europe and the United States. So, we'll get our discussions going. As always, we're happy to take your emails as our conversation goes on. If we've gone beyond a point, it's okay to go back, and if you have a question, we're happy to revisit them. We just sort of try to structure the discussion around the 5 or 6 ideas that you've seen on the website, but we're happy to revisit. Number one, first question, Kim, and welcome. I guess we've briefly welcomed you and wished you a happy birthday, but let me welcome you.
Thank you.
Hey, hi. Why is the opening scene set in the museum, the Victoria and Albert Museum, and what tone does it establish for the book?
Well, I'm not sure I can say in a word why the opening scene is set in a museum, but I think it's fascinating that it is, and it does set a certain tone for the book. I mean, the book is about art and the creation of art, among many other themes. That's an important theme. So it makes sense that we start out in a museum. The museum is about, people of different classes coming together to various kinds of, cataclysmic effects, even if I can say that. And that's what happens in this first scene when a boy, the son of the museum's curator, discovers a kind of hideaway boy in the basement of a much lower social class who's there and is fascinated in drawing the works that he sees, but hiding in the basement, has no place to live, has nothing to eat, and sort of brings the boy out and brings him to his father, and that, helps to set a whole train of events in motion. The museum is where all these art objects are gathered together, are classified and displayed and studied. So it brings a lot of themes together. The museum is also a place of education. The Victoria and Albert Museum, as it came to be called, it was initially founded as the South Kensington Museum, and the notion was to bring together all kinds of manufactured goods and artisan goods, not necessarily fine arts of paintings and sculpture, but broader, what we would call decorative arts, to be studied by aspiring craftspeople and manufacturers, as this boy, Philip Warren, the hideaway boy, is doing, and he later goes on to use those lessons in his life. So it really is a great spot that sets in train a lot of the events of the novel, and it also, for me, is a wonderful opening to a novel because of that great novel that I read when I was much younger that many many people who are watching may have read from the Mixed Up Files of Mrs. Basil Lee Frankweiler about the New York children from Long Island who run away from home and hide in the Metropolitan Museum and live there for a week or so, subsisting on food that they raid from the cafeteria and coins they pick up from the fountain, and they hide at closing time each night, and so on and so forth. So although that's a completely different book, it has a nice resonance for me with this opening scene, which, as I said, immediately drew me into this wonderful novel.
And it really does in this threshold moment in Western culture, right at the turn of the 20th century. There are two very different functions for that museum. Once we discover Philip, it's a place to categorize, to catalog things and study art, but for him it's a place to sleep. And there's this moment where he's on in the crypt or on a tomb, and I don't remember the quote, but it's about not being the least bit uncomfortable sleeping on these bones.
Right, right. That very kind of poignant image of him, as you say, being very comfortable down there in the dark, and I mean, it's a flat place to rest. It can't be very comfortable, but he's not sort of scared or put off by the notion that this was someone's tomb. Which is
you're very clear that there are two different worlds here. A world where for whom that history, that memory is something to be kept in the basement. If you're the upper class, we don't talk about that. And for someone who lives this every day, well, what's to be afraid of? And so it very clearly sets up what the class distinction. And the difference in memory, which also plays an important part, how you remember and what memory means to you going forward.
Yes, absolutely. And also, and we may come to this later, there are a lot of interesting threads in this novel, and what to make of them, I'm not sure, but just having to do with things that happen underground. I mean, a lot of the fairy tales have an underground aspect, right? It opens right up with them finding this young boy underground and chasing him to earth, as it were. Mm-hmm. Clay comes from underground, the potter's clay. I mean, all those things, and this takes us right into that underground world in a very interesting and particular way.
And let's just sort of list maybe some of the themes that came to mind and that I've seen also in just doing some research about the book. The theme of underground and above ground, fantasy and reality, what's real and what's not, and responsibility and who's responsible for whom, and I guess childhood and adulthood, some of the key themes. And I don't know if anything else sort of grabbed you along the way as major themes.
Well, I mean, I think there's so much in this book. I mean, some of it probably even went by me. I mean, I was just reviewing the book in preparation for our discussion and remembering, the millions of details and the different strands that the author weaves in. But certainly sort of relations between people of different classes, I think, is a theme that runs through and, is always of interest in English literature in particular. But I think that, again, as we've said, gets set up right away in the book. But all those themes seem important, and the weaving together of these different strands. And did we say fantasy and reality? I think you said that. Mm-hmm. But that's an important one too, toggling back and forth between the fairy tales and the imaginings, and what is happening in the narrative of the novel.
There's a great moment in here. I did mark this one because it jumped out. It's fairly early in the book when the sort of the men are all talking about the big political issues of the day and socialism and Fabian socialism and the sort of the exploitation of the worker and what the gold is really worth and whose gold it is. And this sort of heady intellectual conversation, and then the boys and girls listened. Tom tasted the plum kernels and oats in his dry mouth. He knew he would sleep badly. Philip wrinkled his brow and backed away. Those lives held up to horrify were his life. He was one of the many who were poor, and he had left his poor mother and his sisters poorer, and he felt dully angry, not with Basil, the rich man, but with Humphrey, who had made him into an object and appropriated his hunger. I mean, he's really interpreting, he's living on the ground, and these guys, they've done just that intellectually, appropriated his hunger and turned it into a cause, which is a kind of a fantasy for them. It is fantasy because they don't live it.
Right.
And here's this kid who's nothing but angry that you would take the one thing I have, which is my poverty. Give it back.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are many intellectual themes that run through the book, but I think all the sort of lefty political issues of the day. I mean, anarchism, socialism, all these different strands in different countries of Europe, and of many artists, not only in England and Germany, but also in France, although France isn't really dealt with in this novel, are interested in these, what we would view as rather extreme political movements that have their moments, and again, weave into what ultimately contributes to the causes of World War I. But those are important themes in the book too. And I think for me, who's not a specialist in the politics of the era, a lot of it probably kind of went over my head a little bit. But I think that's okay. And even, sometimes I didn't always know, was this a real social movement, or did the author make this up? I mean, she tends to draw the real historical facts in rather than making up a lot of things, but it almost doesn't matter in a way because, she's using it in the service of this very important story. Another theme that we have to talk about, I think, is the theme of, women's issues, women's suffrage, feminist issues, women's health, women's bodies, women's education, what sort of jobs are open to them, and that resonates throughout the novel from the point of view of the children, the girl children, and the mothers, and as the children grow up. And again, we're sort of in on the ground floor on some of these issues, as they would be happening to people of different classes of the day. I mean, we have Olive Wellwood and all of her issues as an author and a mother and a wife who's been cheated on, and I mean, all the different things that she is. And then someone like Elsie Warren, Philip's sister, who, like Philip, comes from this very impoverished background, and indeed, like Olive, for that matter, we discover, and bears a child out of wedlock. And anyway, all these, through her sort of fascination, again, with one of these free-thinking intellectuals, and all these things play out across the broad landscape of the novel.
Well, as long as you're right there and giving us the broad sweep, Melanie has a question, and the book takes place in the midst of the suffrage movement, as you say. What is Byatt saying about women's sexuality?
Well, gosh, that's a big question. I mean, I think she's showing us, I think she's trying to show us the difficulties that women face, or faced certainly at this time. I mean, the tough choices they had to make when they even had a choice, the fairly narrow options that were open to them, that, birth control was not something that was available or could be relied upon. I mean, childbirth was hard. I was very struck by the way the novel deals with, children who died in the Wellwood family, for example, and the other children remembering them and how old they would have been, and, sort of holding those memories dearly, whereas the more impoverished families, it's just better not to even think about it. I mean, they had to sleep in the bed with the child who died and had to lie there for 3 days. And I mean, things like that are just so poignant and really bring home to you the difficulties that women faced, I think, in a very vivid way, more than reading a history about things would do. I mean, Dorothy's struggles to receive her medical education, and I think I probably need to review this more closely, and a reader who's read it more recently may correct me, but I suppose she did become a doctor rather than a nurse in the end, but it wasn't so easy.
It was a tough choice because she's really having to almost renounce, in many ways, the privileges what there were of femininity.
Right. I mean,
in order to
having a
become
family
doctor.
and having to give up that traditional life, which was a tough choice for her, as we see. Right. So I think A.S. Byatt sees it in a fairly negative light, at least as she's in the period that she's examining.
Well, it brings us really to the second question when we see the choice that Olive made to be a fantasy writer. The novel shuttles back and forth repeatedly between what's real and what's not real. There's wonderful scenes where they're watching the play and Midsummer Night's Dream and puppet shows and all of that. How does this advance the narrative and develop the novel's plot and themes?
Well, I think sometimes we're not quite sure what's real and unreal. I mean, sometimes we totally know the Midsummer Night's Dream is a play that they have at this Midsummer Night party that they have every year. And we know when we're reading the fairy tales because they're in italics. But we wonder, what does this refer to in the narrative of the novel? What does it match up to? And again, I'm not sure I even was able to make all those connections. And it's fairly clear which of the fairy tales are each child's story that Olive is writing for them and which ones are, stories that she's writing for publication. But not always. And there are all kinds of fantasies that we wonder about. Does this represent something in reality? From the most disturbing one of the cupboard of the sort of pornographic ceramics that Benedict Flood has made, and what does this represent? I mean, is it his fantasy, or is it, did he use his own children as models, as might be suggested? I mean, we don't know, and so that sort of fairy tale fantasy is right at the heart of the novel, I think. And again, we can, and others more expert in this than I might see even more, but I mean, we think of the Grimm brothers fairy tales having been produced in 19th century Germany and harking back to much earlier fairy tales, and we think of the Grimm brothers as focusing on the most macabre aspects and presenting it in the way that's most, when we read it today. And all that's in this novel, again, in this very interesting and rather wonderful way. But what is real, what isn't real? And I think we wonder that as we read through the novel and as we advance. The friend who first recommended this book to me said, I loved this book and it was wonderful, except I got a little impatient with those fairy tales. Sometimes I just wanted to skip them because I wanted to see what was happening in the sort of real world of the novel, and I didn't have patience for those and how they fit in. And I felt a little bit that way myself, but I sort of made myself read them as they came up, and I've been sort of going back and rereading them now and trying to tie them into particular aspects of the novel, and there's a lot of richness there. Again, I'm still sort of teasing it out, but I was reading that very first one about the child whose name is Pig, or whose nickname is Pig, he's causing trouble, and his mother, who's a single mother and has difficulty putting the food on the table, is trying to make supper, and he's getting in the way and spreads his marbles all over the floor, and she trips over them, and she sends him outside. She gets mad, and he goes into the wilderness and, eats the fern seeds and shrinks and enters this world of these little people underground and can't be retrieved. She goes looking for him, and she is able to see him down there but can't get him back again. And then the novel goes on, and you're like, well, okay, mothers and sons, maybe this relates to certain things. But much later in the novel, I just was discovering Philip goes for a ramble to the seashore, and he finds a stone like the stone that Pig had that he looked down into the tree roots with. And so that made me connect up Philip with this pig, which I hadn't really done before, and his own separation from his mother and so on and so forth. So I think there are many strands like that in the novel where the fantasy helps give us another perspective on the reality.
Yeah, and I think it's meant to be embedded in your consciousness and in your imagination to do just that, so that the image is there, because in a way that's what the fairy tale is meant to do. It's a way of getting control of that horrible life that you're going to face. So coming from me, here's the story, here's the fantasy, see, not so bad, but it's an image that you can now, having heard the story told by your mother at bedtime, these Grimm fairy tales, carry with you, and then it resonates against the reality of your life. That's how fairy tales, the psychologists tell us, are supposed to work. And I think that's precisely what Byatt does in this book, but it does take patience and a different kind of reading than we of the short attention span are used to. So, well, why don't let's move on to the next question, because I think it really, they all come together. A reviewer characterized the book as being about responsibility to oneself and others. Does that characterization ring true? Is this about responsibility?
I think we can certainly sense that in the novel. Again, the responsibility of parents to children maybe being the most vivid, although I suppose the responsibility of husbands to wives and wives to husbands, but maybe more so the other way, also comes out. I have to confess that for me, responsibility wasn't top of mind as I read this, although certainly it rang true when I read it in the review. But I mean, certainly it's important. But there were other things going on in the novel that were more interesting to me. Although where this is perhaps at the heart, I mean, when we make this discovery that all of Olive and Humphrey's children are not Olive's, and all of Olive and Humphrey's children are not Humphrey's, that kind of shakes us to the foundations. It's this Victorian family, although they're not exactly straight-laced Victorians, but more the free thinkers who wear the Liberty gowns and get involved in liberal causes, but they're coming out of that very conventional social structure. When we discover that, we're shaken, and we do wonder about those responsibilities. And Humphrey and Olive talk about that a lot. Like, I mean, I'll take care of your children, I'll take care of your children. And the children are wondering, what do they mean by that? I mean, aren't they, our children? And so we do see that running through. And I did suggest it as a discussion topic, but it's not exactly top of mind for me, I must say. I may be missing something there.
I missed it too, but what's very interesting is I've read a number of interviews with Byatt herself, and she said the impetus, the reason she wrote this book was the thought of those turn-of-the-century children's writers, the writers of Peter Pan and what were some of the others? People like J.M. Barrie, here they are, Edith Nesbit, Kenneth Graham. When she looked at their families, they were a wreck, and the children of those writers were often pushed in a couple of cases, suicide, but in any event, their lives not very good. And that got her to wondering about what was going on in this period that drove people to write fantasy and apparently not take responsibility for their own family. What was going on there?
Yeah, and I think I hadn't actually made that connection, but that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, you can even, not to point the finger at anyone in particular, but you think of someone like Roald Dahl, who wrote for children and who also had a kind of a chaotic family life and write these wonderful stories for children, have all these great, psychological effects, and are very engaging to children and an endearing part of family life and memories of family life for those of us who read them to our kids. But I think that's very... Yeah, that's another layer here where the reality of history, it can enrich our understanding of what the author is doing. Because certainly in this family, and just the fact that Olive, at the end of the day, I mean, she provides a very significant part of the family income, especially when Humphrey leaves his financial job, by writing these fantastic children's stories. This sort of genteel occupation, in fact, is keeping the whole household going. But that's a very interesting point to contemplate.
It's interesting to contemplate, but I, like you, didn't feel that so much reading the book. And it's fascinating to see her talk about it because it's the first thing she brings up in every interview. It didn't come through as strongly, I think, because Olive is a somewhat sympathetic character. I mean, you don't see her as sort of wrecking the whole family.
Right. I mean, she's trying to kind of hold it together in her own way. Well, and I guess, for every author, there's a starting point, which may not be what emerges to the readers as the most pervasive and engaging aspect of the novel, but it makes good sense, and it's very interesting. I mean, for me, what I love about A.S. Byatt, I mean, she's such an intelligent writer, and as a rule, I don't always love historical novels. Often the bits of history aren't very well integrated or aren't very what's the word I want? Well, they just aren't
very
always
smooth, and sometimes it can get didactic.
Aren't always convincingly integrated, or they don't. They'll do it great in scene one, but then in scene two they forget to integrate history as well. And she is just incredible the whole way through. I mean, the strands that she incorporates, and if you read her acknowledgments about how she learned about the German puppet theater scene at the time and the museums that she visited to understand that better, and as we talked about, her command of the literature of all these social movements and the women's suffrage movement, and her amazing descriptions of the clothes that the women wore, the Liberty embroidered clothes, and the freer styles that became popular at this time, especially for more liberated or advanced women. Let's forget about these corsets, this Victorian way of confining our figure. Let's find a freer way to dress and a more comfortable way to be, especially during pregnancy. And she just has all of that. She has all of that. And her descriptions of the Victoria and Albert Museum and the interiors there are very historically accurate, even though many changes have occurred in the intervening, times. She's just unbelievable the way she handles the historical context. And I think for me, that was probably the very most engaging aspect of this novel. I mean, who wouldn't want to read a novel with, your cover's different, but with a beautiful Art Nouveau dragonfly on the cover? How could you not want to read something like that? Is how I approached it.
No, you're right. I mean, I think that the idea of how well she integrated it, and it moves. It just keeps moving. And I sometimes can get a little stuck on description. I can want to move on. I mean, I don't mind the storytelling so much. I can hang in there. And I read every word. I didn't want to stop. So I don't know how she does that. And to learn that she'd researched it, somehow you think she just sort of sprung from the womb with all this information because it was so beautifully, so quickly synthesized. I mean, to do research and turn around and to process it this way is hard to do.
Right. And she'll give us a little bit of the great events of what year it is and what's happening. But then there'll be a focus on, a minor, or to me at least, a today little-known Russian anarchist funeral in London or something, and all the mourning that took place, and it was an important event of the day, although now lost to history. Now, I don't know if that's made up or real, but it certainly comes across as real to me. Yeah, and she integrates these more minor events as well as the things that we would know from the history books.
Well, and I wondered about that. I mean, I sort of wondered why. Again, I was able to get through it and read it and found it all interesting, and it did add context. But I thought, you probably could have dropped it. So is there some more subtle message? And, of course, everybody's surprised in this book that World War I breaks out. And, again, a museum is a place where things are codified, they're organized in a way, and that's how these minds are working, even though the progressive minds are opening up a little bit. So the idea that your history and your life is really made up of all of these events that you consider peripheral or even inconsequential, they really have a bearing on what's going on. It to me became a subtext. It's a way of saying, watch out what you ignore. Be careful.
Yes. I think that's a very good point. These things that may, well, even what we do read in the history books about the start of World War I, it was such a kind of, seemingly in the scheme of things, the Archduke in in Sarajevo who gets murdered. I mean, why did that set off a global war? Let me understand that again. And it sort of fits in with what you're saying. It doesn't seem that huge of a thing. I mean, it's not like Russia, Germany invaded France, and that's not what set it off. And that, I think, maybe answers a bit our question of the significance of the inconsequential event.
Why don't we move on to the next point? And what we'll do is, rather than ask it this way, we'll take Joanne's question, which is there is a strong underground theme here regarding the characters as well. Florence doesn't admit who got her pregnant. Elsie and Charles get married, which is not revealed till the end of the book. Violet had 2 of the Wellwood children. Second is revealed in the closing pages. Tom never talks about the Horde experience in college. It leads to his demise. Other characters have romantic feelings, all not expressed until later, if at all. There is an abundance of underground personalities and feelings and actions far off from the reader. And so I guess the question, well, let's just talk about that, the power of that. And, of course, we begin by chasing Philip underground.
Right. And we talked a little bit already about just many underground themes and metaphors. But, yes, indeed, the human relationships and what is revealed much later, and some things only at the very end. And I think that's a not something that we uncommonly find in novels. Something that was hidden is later revealed. I mean, that's, A.S. Byatt wasn't the first author to do that, but it's very powerful here. Things that are hidden. Again, for me, finding out about the Wellwoods children and that not all of them were Olive's, and then also that Dorothy wasn't Humphrey's child, and we're led to that revelation in this sort of horrible advances that Humphrey makes to her, and the sort of violent denouement of that. And what is A.S. Byatt saying to us here? I think it has to do with the violence of human emotions. Tom is this very almost mysterious character, at least I found. I mean, he's Olive's favorite child. They have this close relationship. He feels that she betrays him in a couple of ways that she doesn't understand are going to have such a profound effect. And then he goes away to school and has these very difficult experiences that he just can't come to grips with or tell anyone about, and eventually ends up killing himself. These are very, very powerful emotions, and I think the author uses them to take us through the narrative, to make points she wants to make about the human condition, about this notion of responsibility, I think. And, we need to, or she needs to reveal these slowly, or letting things be as letting things appear differently than how they really are, and then uncovering it. I can't really plumb the mysteries of that other than to say it's a great technique in fiction, and I think it resonates with all of us in terms of emotions that we feel and may not even realize in our own lives, and things that we have to deal with over time.
And in part it's because there isn't a narrative or a framework in which we're permitted to understand it. If it's in a Victorian marriage, there's a husband and a wife, and the children who are a part of that family came from that union. There's no other way to explain how you got there. It's going to take a long time for us to come to this realization that, in fact, you came from somewhere else, because we didn't have a way to tell it. Tom doesn't have a way to tell his story. And you can see how angry he is when the Peter Pan myth is the thing that really does it for him. You know, it's people making up. And his mother's in the business of making this up, and so she thinks this is wonderful. I'm giving you this wonderful story. It's about the boy, and he says, I need to grow up, and I need to express I need to have a way to say this. And there is no way.
Yes.
And it's in a way, I think, married to this other question of the seemingly peripheral details. There are large political events happening outside of your frame of reference that are a part of your life, and you're going to find out sooner or later. And then there are these deeply personal events that are happening, so the personal is political and the political is personal. And she's, in my estimation, has rendered that artistically as well as anybody, and perhaps better than anyone.
Yeah, and we've talked about the Wellwood family, but we can talk about the Flood family as well. I mean, this very, difficult, tortured artist that is the father, and, whatever secrets he may be holding. I mean, he comes to the rector, whose name I can't remember right offhand, and wants to make a confession, and he tells about this relationship that he's had with a prostitute and having thoughts of wanting to murder her but not acting on them, and then he comes to visit her one night and she has been murdered, and we're like, well, did he do that? Or what more is there to that gruesome story? The wife who's the zombie, the very odd daughters. We don't know what's going on in the family. We referred to the pornographic ceramics before. And then the son, Geraint, who's, very practical and, ends up becoming a businessman. And, as if part of it, we've got to organize this household and make money, and we've got to pay Philip a living wage, and let's try to market these ceramics. And I mean, he's sort of the complete antithesis from the others in the family, but there too much is hidden, and some of it is never quite revealed to us. The story of that family. I feel like we get a better handle in the end, perhaps on the Wellwoods, but the floods, remain somewhat mysterious. At least that's how I found them. But the themes that you describe, I think, are very well illustrated in that family as well.
Yeah, and she certainly shows that it can come in two different packages. And again, I think this idea of what does this artistic life mean to your actual family? So you've got Benedict Flood, who's, this guy worries you. He's the creepy guy you think ought to be registered somewhere. And yet Humphrey Wellwood gropes his daughter, arguing that she's not really.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
so
Yeah.
so he's on a spectrum somewhere. And again, Olive, the artist who's not quite in touch with her family, but much more benign. We like her. She tells fairy stories. So to me, that was an interesting sort of juxtaposition of those two artists. One of who is this crazy guy you want to register, as
Yeah.
you say, and another one you're happy to have lunch with.
Yeah, and I think as you point out, this theme of of art is another. I mean, who is an art? What are the characteristics of the artist? And we have these two artists to compare: the writer and the potter, and then the others around them. And how does art get made? Then what happens to it? It gets sold in the market. It goes into the museum. All this against the background of William Morris and his innovations, that let's get away from the machine-made, back to the handcrafted. Let's be inspired by medieval aesthetics and ways of working by hand in creating arts and crafts, objects and materials and decorative arts, things that we live with, furniture, pottery, fabrics, and so forth. All that's part of the DNA of this novel. And, what is art and who makes it? What is the role of art in our lives? How important is it or isn't it? Is it a positive force or a destructive force as it becomes in the Flood family, and even indeed in the Wellwood family, although it also provides income and inspiration and so forth. So that's a huge theme in this novel, and one that's of great interest to me, and sort of fitting this in to the history of art in England in particular. This is a real footnote, but I'll throw it in. Having done an exhibition on Bloomsbury at the Nasher Museum, and having on view now an exhibition on the Vortices, a slightly later art movement in England that was very radical abstraction, but again, artists who were very interested in anarchist points of view and wanted to sweep away all that was old and, out with the old Victorian and, in with the modern. This is a different aesthetic. This ties more to arts and crafts, which has a more nostalgic, looking back way of thinking about how art should develop. But all of this is very fascinating to the art historian and to the museum goer, I think.
Well, in a footnote to the footnote, the Nasher does an excellent job, in my opinion, of doing just that, of putting art in context. So whether or not you're sort of in tune with the contemporary art world, if you go, you'll understand why this was important, not only to the world of art, but to the world of politics and socially, culturally, politically, where it all fits, which is what I think any exhibition of art, whether it's in a novel or a museum, ought to be doing. So congratulations.
Oh, well, thanks.
Here's an email. In chapter 36, when contemplating marriage, Florence thinks she did see her future as perhaps the choice between thinking and sex. Several of the female characters have a deep desire for both, perhaps a conflict Duke women today could identify with, but sex has unwanted consequences in the story. Only Dorothy resists the temptations of sexual desire, but she is seen as something cold and too driven. And I don't know if there's more to that. Let's make sure that I'm at the bottom. But I guess we could talk about that. Well, and whether or not these women, in fact, had a choice. I mean, Dorothy, it seems to me, perhaps she was driven, or perhaps when she made a choice, she was forced to leave that other world that was open to other women.
I mean, I don't see. Well, I see choice being presented, or women having to take one path or the other, but not very readily being able to do both things. I mean, Olive maybe, because of the profession that she chose, which can be pursued at home and, fit in between other things. and didn't require, a rigorous education on top of what she would have otherwise gotten. But Dorothy, absolutely. And, her pal Griselda, who's also wanting to become educated in her conventional family. This is the daughter of Humphrey's brother Basil Wellwood and his wife Katerina. It's very difficult to do both those things. And I think Byatt presents it as a choice that has to be made, not that there isn't really much of a way to do both things. And I do think it's different today. I mean, for Duke women or educated women, anywhere, it is more possible to do both things, although certainly not easy. I mean, we still struggle with these contradictions. But my reading of this book is that you really, you were going to have to privilege one thing over the other. And even Olive, who maybe is able to straddle it a bit, isn't very happy about that. I mean, it's a difficult life for her, and it's only even possible because of the flexibility that is embedded in the profession that she chooses. But yet, ironically, she's a mainstay of her family's income. So, again, as we discussed before, I don't see a real positive message there in Byatt's book, but I do see a very poignant foregrounding of the issue, and that at this time when women's rights were really being thought about and talked about, certainly as never before. I mean these conversations wouldn't have even taken place, in the early 19th century or even the mid 19th century. So the issues are being explored, and some of the minor characters, Miss Dace, I think her name is, who helps Elsie when she's pregnant, who is always, organizing, improving lectures in the community, and herself didn't marry, but has devoted her, has chosen the life of the mind, if you will. I mean, we see the issues being raised in ways that we, would not see in literature focusing on an earlier period, or history focusing on an earlier period.
The issues are raised, they're discussed intellectually throughout the book, and Byatt gives us historical breakouts of and yet it does seem, and this book has also been described as an homage to Middlemarch in some ways, that all of this discussion and all of these movements in the ferment, and even the bomb tossing and the demonstrations, aren't the thing that bring about the change. I mean, or can we read it that way, that the change is happening by some other subterranean, if we want to get back to that theme, mysterious forces that may be at work, but not necessarily moved by the intellectual effort of the intellect and the effort of the people who think they're in charge of the movements.
Yeah, and certainly, as you said earlier, Frank, right, I mean, things get discussed, and then you see that issue from the point of view of a person who's experiencing it, and the discussion isn't really informing what's happening to them. So I think that's definitely put in place. And I mean, you mentioned Middlemarch. I mean, and yet it's true, even if women's issues have advanced at the time period of this novel. I mean, women were writing novels, certainly in the 19th century and in the 18th century. I mean, who's one of our greatest novelists? Jane Austen, of course, and she was writing at a much earlier time, before any of these things had come into the foreground. I hadn't really thought about that whole strand, but that's certainly true as well.
Well, and in Middlemarch, there's all this heady discussion, and yet it's these networks of sort of women who are actually making things happen that isn't foregrounded, but it's in the book. I mean, the book sort of illustrates those, or shows in shadow this whole other subterranean movement.
And then at the very end of the book, when this sort of touching, reunion at the end of World War I, the soldier, Charles / Carl, the son of Basil and Katerina, whom they thought was dead, comes back, and to his family and his child that he hasn't seen, and his wife, and those who remain are reunited. It's kind of it's an interesting ending for A.S. Byatt with all the sort of difficulties that she foregrounds throughout the novel. It's kind of a happy end, a bittersweet in a way, but kind of a happy ending. It's all about family. It's all about love. It's all about, being reunited with your spouse and your children. And, it's all those sort of good emotions, in quite a traditional way, really, at least the way I read it. Again, I may be missing something that you or our readers will see, but that's the note it ends on, and I think we might ask ourselves why that is, or what message that is bringing.
And you certainly can't dismiss that, because that's the ending. But then there are an awful lot of bodies at the doorstep that led up to that happy moment, and they are dispatched quickly, unlike the rest of the book that unfolds slowly.
True. I mean, it's right. Maybe happy isn't quite the word. That's a good point. Many must die to get to that happy ending. Yeah.
Well, let's get to the fifth question, and I guess we can talk about we can use our emails to get us to this point, which is the sheer girth of this novel. Do you think the book, Joanne wants to know, could have been effective if it had been half or three-quarters as long? The length made it difficult to finish because of how long it takes to read.
Yeah, well, I was joking with you earlier. Why did I choose such a long book for our discussion? We all have our deadlines, and it would have been smarter to choose a shorter book. I don't know. I loved the book, and it took about 100 pages to get into it, and then I just couldn't put it down, and I was sorry when it ended. So for me, I didn't mind the length. And again, I loved the detail, I loved the history, I loved the reasons why it was so long. It was all good for me. Could it have been shorter? I'm sure that certainly for some readers it could have been and would have been better to be a bit shorter. But for me, I loved the interweaving of all the different details, the description, the history, all the things we've mentioned, the interleaving of fact and fiction, and the coming back to characters that we'd met many years before. I could have used a list of characters in the front. I think that might have helped us all when we have to put things down, although maybe, I was just thinking about this today, making my own list of characters, maybe that would have revealed too much, in a way that the author perhaps wouldn't have wanted to do. But for me, it was not too long. But I sense from the question that perhaps it was for some of our readers. Although it's interesting that the author's editors didn't say, gee, this is too long, when she presented the manuscript, make this shorter.
She is A.S. Byatt. So at this point...
Right, at this point. She can make it however long she wants.
She can make it however long she wants. But I will say it's ingenious, and I do have a difficulty getting through a long book because of how long it takes me to read. So it means that I have to keep reviewing, and I didn't have a problem reading this. The energy, and we joked about when Middlemarch was the choice. I joked with Anne, who chose the book, about just my inability to get through it because of the style of the book. I couldn't get through it. This thing moves quickly, and even when it breaks out into these historical breakouts. But I do think it's that ability to resonate. And so what she's doing is playing with the way your mind works. It's not simply spinning a story. She's asking you to reflect on how your mind moves back and forth between fiction and reality, and what your mind does when it's confused about that. Watch yourself, she's saying, when I do this to you. That's part of what these historical movements were grappling with, and why things ended, the way they did, or transpired the way they did.
Yeah, and I think, again, for me, I sort of keep coming back to this, but, being interested in history and history of this period, it was all great. And when, for example, when they visit Paris for the International Exposition of 1900, and they see Art Nouveau, this new style, and they're very excited, and it can bring back ideas to the pottery, I just thought, oh, how wonderful. She brings them to Paris in 1900. How fantastic. And the fiction and the fact come together. And, that was a very vivid moment for me, where I loved that happening. But there were other moments in the book where it also was a wonderful marriage of fact and fiction. And I think, the length is needed to allow for that kind of thing. So I think if you like that kind of thing, it isn't too long.
Well, I'm going to ask this. This is Joanne again, and I think we've talked about it, but I'm going to maybe recontextualize the question a bit. For those interested in history, I feel the historical detail detracts from the enjoyment of the book. I found the characters interesting, liked it interwoven, but I think the novel would have held my attention better if she had focused on the people rather than adding so much history. We've talked about that, but let's ask it this way. What is this novel? How does it hold up as a simple story? If we're simply following these characters, let's pull the history breakouts out. It wouldn't be the same novel, obviously, and it wouldn't have had the same impact, but would it have been a great novel, a good novel?
I think, again, that's a hard question. I mean, I think it could have been, because I think the narrative and emotional relationships between the characters are interesting and could be set in another time period or could transcend this particular time period. I mean, I say that and I probably need to think about it more, but I think, the family that is not what it appears and the different people who've been involved with its construction and, the sort of underpinnings that are hidden. I mean, whether the wife's sister or, the mysterious German artist who comes to visit and, produces one of the children, the struggles that the children have in growing up and the attention or neglect that they receive from their parents. I think those things could have been set in another period, and the sort of all the love matchups that occur across time and, so forth. I think those could have been set in a different period, but of course, I mean, they have to be set in some time period. I don't know. For me, I think the story does have human interest, emotional interest nonetheless. But I particularly love the way it's interwoven into this time period. And again, the museum, the World's Fair, the visit to Germany, the culmination with World War I, the social movements of the 1890s and how those intersect with the world of the visual arts. Just give it more to me. I just keep coming back to that.
I feel the same way. The genius of this book is that I believe you could have pulled out every one of those, and this book holds up as a novel. So the architecture then is ingenious, if that's true. It wouldn't have been the same book, and I don't think it would have been as rich at all. So in other words, in my opinion, they weren't appendages. They weren't simple add-ons, because Byatt needs to tell you that she's pretty smart and knows about this stuff. It did strike me that one of the ways you can do this as a novelist is you can have Philip or Prosper or Humphrey can be reading the paper, and they can read about this assassination or this funeral and say, these anarchists, what's this world coming to? And he can put it down. So we get a little bit of context. We understand historically what's going on, and it was 3 sentences, not 4 pages, right? And you can do that. But then you get that from Humphrey's point of view, and you understand that Humphrey knows about this. And some of the way the detail is entered in this book, they're not aware of this. That's the point. The point is these things are happening, and it's not filtered through any of the characters, and that means something. Right.
And yet, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. And yet, I mean, again, having mentioned her before as a favorite author, you think back to Jane Austen, who doesn't give you the history of the age. Right. I mean, if you study Jane Austen, you're interested to perhaps fill that in and to remember what's going on. I mean, maybe she does a little bit in Persuasion with the naval captain and, the background of the Napoleonic Wars, but mostly you don't hear about any of that stuff, and it doesn't matter. And I mean, certainly those themes and relationships between men and women are timeless. And it works beautifully in setting a historical stage as well. But it's a very different method than what we find here. Very different, to be sure.
I think it's ingenious. And in so many ways, it looked a lot like a novel of a bygone age, but because of the way it worked on the mind and worked against type and even against the form of the novel, I think it makes it a very modern book.
And she's very interested in psychology. I mean, if you read her books or just, I mean, it's just an enduring interest of hers. And I mean, you referred to the psychological functioning of fairy tales and children's stories. And she's always interested in psychology, and that comes through. And that's a very, well, you know, certainly later than World War I in terms of the way she thinks about it.
You've asked us to read 3 books. We only have 1 hour to talk about it, and that hour has expired. But I'm deeply grateful to you because I know I wouldn't have picked this up on my own, and it's a wonderful book. And thank you so much.
Well,
What a
thank
pleasure.
you, Frank. Great conversation.
Kim Rorschach starts off Duke Read. Thank you for tuning in and participating. And I should remind you that the next Duke Reads is going to be Wednesday, November 17th, 7 o'clock. And the Dean of the Pratt School of Engineering will be here. He's a professor of engineering. He's going to discuss the Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fall or Succeed by Jared Diamond. So please send in your questions and comments in advance. Also, I want to call your attention to office hours on Friday, October 8th. It will feature Marcy Lowe, Senior Research Analyst at Duke's Center for Globalization, Governance, and Competitiveness. She's going to take questions from online viewers on going green, on her research on economics and green jobs. So that is office hours, Friday, October 8th, Marcy Lowe. We'll be back on November 17th at 7 o'clock. And if you want to listen to this session again, you can go to Duke On Demand in a day or so. Meanwhile, we will see you on November 17th. Thank you.